These are mistakes that I've seen a lot of professional designers make in Figma who have experience of I don't know how many years. So you should definitely avoid them, because when I see these mistakes, I just know that these people don't really know how to use Figma, honestly. So the first mistake that we're going to talk about is obviously not grouping layers. So I have a design in front of me. This is my own design. If I go here, as you can see, I intentionally went ahead and let's just ungrouped items. So I have ungrouped items. I also have not renamed items or like grouped items with particular names. So as you can see, I have the search bar since that's already created as a component. But if I now, let's say you want to move things around or drag it, like again, everything's just like really disorganized on the left-hand side. Whereas if you look at the original file that I have here, everything is organized right in the layers panel here. So I have my header, then I have the search bar, then I have the content. So in the content, I have everything grouped and renamed accordingly. And then even those group are auto layout groups. So that's really important. So again, trending courses, current course, categories. So it's really easy for me to again just collapse things or just to move one particular item just using the sidebar and see what the structure of the application is. So that's problem number one. Always try to group things and also group them by using the correct names for those groups so they're identifiable. So that's one. The other thing I'd like to talk about is grouping, using groups instead of framing. So don't usually, like people, when they're, let's say, grouping things, they usually just go ahead, I'm going to go here and I'm going to press Command G. So in most cases, what you want to do is you want to use the frame technique or the frame method to group things. And the reason for that is when you're using frames, you can apply a background directly on the frame itself. Whereas let's say if you were using a group, there's no way you can actually add a background or let's say some auto layout to it or anything. So as an example, if I just go ahead and create two rectangles here, I'm going to add a group. Now I want to add, let's say, a background behind these groups. I want to say that there should be a red background. If I go and choose red, as you can see, this red is not applying the background to the group, rather it's applying it to the actual elements that are sitting inside it. And that's something that you usually don't want. So what you should do is you should use the Command Option G key to group things in a frame. And then now you can go ahead and you can give a background behind it. Similarly, you can convert it into an auto layout. You can apply a padding to it. You can do whatever you want, because even in an auto layout, as you can see, the auto layout works very similar to frames, whereas you can go ahead and apply borders, strokes, background, so on and so forth. So always try to use frames instead of groups. In most cases, 99 out of 10, I would recommend using frames instead of groups. I honestly don't or rarely use groups, and I don't think you should either. So never use groups and always use frames. So I'm going to say group using frames instead, or group using group instead of frames. I think that's a bit more clear. So always use frames. Mistake number 3 is using rectangles as a background, and this is just such a horrible mistake. So imagine I have these components here. This is the category card, right? I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to detach this category card. And currently, as you can see, the background is being applied as a fill. But what I've seen a lot of people do is they actually, let me just go ahead and remove the auto layout. What they do is they actually create a rectangle inside of it, scale it, unfortunately, and this is just so horrible, they scale it to fit the container that's there. And then they obviously go ahead, and I'm just going to add this background here. They add this background to the rectangle, and now I'm going to go ahead and remove this. Now this looks very similar, but what happens when you try to create an auto layout around it? Because ideally this should be an auto layout, right? If I go ahead and resize this, this should work as an auto layout. But now if I go to the actual container and apply an auto layout to it, as you can see, the background is removed. Why? Because Figma is clever enough to understand that the background should be applied to the actual container rather than as a separate element. So always, always, always use or apply backgrounds on the actual frame rather than on the actual, rather than as a rectangle or as a circle or whatever it is that you want to give it as as a shape layer. So never apply the background as a shape layer. There are going to be instances where some sections may have, let's say I'm going to create like, let's say a larger section. We have some heading here. This is my heading. And then we have some description. And then maybe you want to use like a blob as a background. If you want to use a blob and you just want to place it somewhere, then that's perfectly fine. You can do that. You don't have to go ahead and change that into a frame, because obviously you can't really change that into a frame. That is going to be a shape, and then you can apply a background to this shape itself if you want to. But what I'm saying is that the frame itself, the container for a button, for especially elements, smaller elements, so on and so forth, should actually have the background, not rectangles or any shapes that are inside of it. So that's one major thing. That's another major thing. Then we obviously have the problem of not using an auto layout, which I've already pointed out quite a couple of times in some of the other videos. I'm also going to link that video like explaining the benefits of auto layout somewhere on the screen, so you can definitely check that out. Now imagine this thing wasn't an auto layout. You could create it as a component, but anytime you go ahead and change the text, obviously it's not scaling well. If you want it to be responsive, it wouldn't work. So you should always use auto layout, and again, do check out the auto layout video as well. Mistake number 5 is obviously not using components. As you can see, this element here, this categories card that I've used, is actually a component that I'm using in, let's say, just 2 places right now. I've created a component even though I'm just using it in 2 places. Like, one is the main component and the other one is the inner component. But especially, and this may take some more time when you're actually creating this particular thing, but imagine when you're creating something like this, or you're creating this, now you want to go ahead and you want to say, I want to, let's say, go ahead and semi-bold it. Now if you did not have, let's say, these components to begin with, I'm going to go ahead and make this semi-bold. Sorry, I'm actually changing the instance. I think I've used this elsewhere as well, so here it is. Now if I, let's say, go ahead and make this bold, as you can see, everything is bold. Even though this takes some time when you're actually creating the structure first, but then if you have to make changes, it's such a pleasure to work with and just easily modify the different things that exist. So definitely do use components, and I'm going to again attach mistakes that people actually do when they're creating components, and I'm going to actually attach a video on the screen as well for you to go ahead and have a look at that as well. So that's one. And then obviously one more problem is not renaming layers in a component. So I'm going to go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show, I've actually highlighted this problem elsewhere as well, but I'm going to highlight it here as well. So imagine these are 2 instances. So I'm going to create category card red, and then I'm going to create another component saying category card slash, I don't know, purple. So I have these 2, and let's just go ahead and make these variants. So I'm going to combine these as variants. Now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to duplicate this thing here. I'm going to say this is like, I'm just going to test it out. So if I have testing, and then if I change that to purple, as you can see, the testing text also changed, and that's not something I intended. The reason for that is when you're creating these components, always make sure that the things that you want to keep consistent in terms of the text layer or shapes or anything have the same layer name. So on the left, I'm going to say this is going to be my title. I'm also going to go here, I'm going to say this is going to be my title. Now if I go ahead and change this to purple, as you can see, that works fine. And that's exactly what we want. We want to keep things consistent. So always rename the layers that you want to keep consistent in your components. The last mistake I want to highlight is, even pro people make this mistake, they actually just take so much time creating design, so much time navigating through the UI of Figma, that it's just like cumbersome to see. So a few shortcuts that I just like to point out. Obviously, you know the shortcut of frames, which is just using the A key, and then obviously grouping elements as frames, which is, let's say if I have 2 rectangles, I can just use Command Option G, that basically groups them as a frame. And then we have the auto layout with the Shift A. So all of these are like basic shortcuts, but the shortcuts that I'm more referring to are, let's say, moving between the assets and the layers panel, which is Option 2 and Option 1. So that's something you should remember. If you want to open the libraries that are linked, you can use that using the Option 4 key. If you use the Option 4 key, Option 3 key, because there's Option 1, Option 2, Option 3, and then you can also go ahead and, let's say, link something. Option P is going to go ahead, sorry, option E is going to go ahead and actually toggle between the design and the prototype section. So option E, I'm pressing it. As you can see, it can toggle it. So those are basic shortcuts. And then obviously we have the component picker, which you can use using the option I key. So all of these things that you should really, again, concern yourself with and just, again, start using, because if you don't use them, they're just going to take a lot of time if you're actually navigating all of these files without necessarily these things in mind. So those are some of the problems that I want to highlight today. Obviously, there are multiple problems that people make when they're using Figma and they're interacting with it, creating designs, so on and so forth. But hopefully this is going to be beneficial for you to stop making these mistakes. And I can come up with some other mistakes that I've seen people making sometime later. So that's going to be pretty much it. Do subscribe, to hit the bell icon, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.